Hey folks, this is Will Larson, and this is a practice run for a talk I'm doing with Dan Fike in a couple of days. So today is Monday, and the talk's on Wednesday. It's going to be at QCon in San Francisco. And what we're talking about is ambiguous problems and ambiguous roles, but really what we're talking about is kind of the principal engineer role and how kind of underdefined it is, and proposing a definition that might be useful for you if you're trying to get into that role, or you happen to be in that role already and just aren't quite sure what the job is. So I'm the CTO at Carta, worked at a few other places before. Dan is the deputy to the CTO at Carta. He's one of Carta's two principal engineers, and we're both going to give a little bit. I'm going to give like an abstract executive-y perspective, and Dan's going to give a concrete, real perspective, not quite as colored by the rose glasses that I wear on a day-to-day basis. I've also written a couple of books, maybe most relevantly here, wrote Staff Engineer, which came out in 2021, and most recently an Engineering Executives Primer that came out earlier this year. And so before we talk about titles, we just have to acknowledge that titles are extraordinarily inconsistent across companies. Here are just three examples from my own experience. When I came to Uber 2014, there were 200 engineers and 0 principal engineers. There were also 0 senior staff. I think we had like 1 or 2 staff engineers at that point. When I came to Com 2019, there were 3 principal engineers, so basically a 1 to 8 ratio. And when I came to Carta, there were 2 engineers at the principal level out of 400, and so like a 1 to 200 ratio. And it's definitely not the case that Com was like a vastly more technically complex organization than Carta's. It's just, titles are a little bit arbitrary, and different companies use them in different ways. And so the first thing we have to recall is that principal engineer at any one company might not be the same as principal engineer at any other company. And that's just kind of inevitable. It's inevitable because all real roles are underdefined. And so if you talk to any principal engineer, what they actually do might be incredibly unclear. Sure, a lot of them might be right hands, but a lot of them might not be right hands. A lot of them might be solvers. And the thing I'd encourage you is not to look at that as like a bug. It's not a bug that different senior roles are unique. In fact, senior roles are incredibly context dependent. And if you want to look at kind of the rarest role in most eng orgs, it's like the CTO. I can only promise you that every CTO role is like completely unique. There is no consistent definition of what a CTO is. There's a lot of disagreement. There's a lot of thought pieces out there about the role of the CTO versus the VP of engineering. There really is no definitive separation. It just depends on the company itself and the individual themselves. And so I would just encourage you, as you think about getting definitions and rubrics and getting things really clear, that sort of approach just doesn't work for roles with very small populations. It's impossible to have consistent rubrics for a group of 1 or 2. It just doesn't really work out in practice. That being said, I do think the role of staff engineer has gotten a little bit more predictable over the last few years. Again, I think the archetypes have been helpful, and particularly around that. And I think we've done something in terms of defining kind of the staff plus roles needing to solve not just a team problem, not just work on something interesting to the individual, but solving like real company visible problems. And that being said, the role of like principal versus senior staff or a staff, that's pretty open-ended. And what I want to propose today is that navigating ambiguous problems is really the core of a principal engineer. If you want to define what makes you a principal engineer and not a staff engineer, it's being able to navigate these deep, broad, messy, often company-scoped, ambiguous problems. And this matters a lot because right now there's many organizations out there that are basically constrained on their CTO or their head of engineering's ability to get enough time and energy to work through these deeply ambiguous problems. I know a lot of companies that have had ambiguous engineering problems they haven't been able to get a clear direction on for years. I think this is in fact the norm. And so I think what the principal engineer needs to bring to actually be a principal engineer is expanding that executive's bandwidth, where it's not just working on any ambiguous problem, but it's working on ambiguous problems that would be basically blocked on your head of engineering if you weren't there to add more bandwidth to them. This is also an interesting definition because it means that you can actually tell if you need principal engineers or not at your company by looking at the number and complexity of the ambiguous problems that are blocked on your head of engineering today. And are they blocked for good reasons they're really hard problems, or are they just blocked because they're indecisive, something like that? So now we have a kind of a rough definition of what might make a principal engineer, and also like a rough definition to help figure out like, do you even need a principal engineer in your company today? Before going too much further, I just want to give like a few examples of what are ambiguous problems, because you might decide anything's an ambiguous problem if you are looking to justify your entry into principal engineer. So what are some good examples? Complying with data locality is a great example, right? It's such a messy problem. It's messy because the laws don't stay the same. The laws shift a lot as you do international expansion. The laws that you're falling under are going to change quite a bit. Your legal team or your compliance team is going to be interpreting these laws, but even they themselves might disagree on what they mean. Many locales are going to have laws but not enforce them, and how you want to navigate that is also really complicated as well. Another one is decomposing a monolithic application, whether you should, whether you shouldn't. If you should, how do you prioritize it? How long do you take? Do you try to go big bang? And if you obviously agree that's a terrible idea, how do you not go big bang and actually make some progress? If you think this is really important, if this is a solution to a real problem, what are you going to do? If it's going to take you like 6 years to prove out the decomposition strategy, is that acceptable or not? Really, really ambiguous problem to work on. Data deletion and retention, again, a ton of different stakeholders, a ton of implications on what the data science teams can actually do. Product features will become impossible to support in some cases, depending on your decisions here. You have legal requirements. You have kind of like custom requirements from certain customers who are trying to get you to delete their data more quickly. You have legal requirements in terms of restoring financial transaction data for the regulators and so on. Tons of different stakeholders who want really different things, really challenging set of problems to work on. Very much ambiguous. Driving quality. So I've been working on this with one of our kind of senior staff engineers at Carta, Shauna Martel, who's giving a talk here as well. And, what does even quality mean? How do we measure it? What do we do if we want to drive it up? Incredibly ambiguous, uncertain problem. And not clear what you do to actually make quick progress on it, right? It's a really challenging problem. It's ambiguous. It's not obvious what you should do, but it's important. How do you do it? And then, lastly, defining principal engineer. And so the thing I want to push you on a little bit is this first of these 5. This is the least important one. You're not going to get promoted to principal by defining like what principal engineer is. But I think if you're saying, hey, I want to be principal, but then you're kind of stuck because you don't know what principal is, you're waiting for someone else to define it for you, I would argue you're not operating like a principal engineer. In fact, defining it and helping create the clarity or an agreement on what it is, that's the sort of problem you have to be able to work on. If you're saying that you need someone to define it for you, I'm not sure you're working at that level yet. Okay. Now that I've challenged you that you might not be a principal engineer, let's work through an example, because I think most of the stuff I've said is a little bit abstract. So let's get into some detail. And the problem I want to talk about is, how do you allow access to customer data? It's been a problem I've been thinking about a lot at Carta. We have like a pretty robust mechanism that controls access to customer data, but historically it was pretty challenging to actually use. A lot of internal teams felt that it slowed them down unduly and made it very challenging to do their work. So conversely, a lot of teams like our customer kind of contracts we've signed, our compliance, our security team, all of engineering and product are really sensitive about how we allow access. So this has been a problem we've been thinking about quite a bit, and that I've personally been thinking about quite a bit, working with, again, a couple of our senior most engineers at the company, including the aforementioned Shauna Martel. And so let's dig into it. So when you start working on an ambiguous problem, the first thing you have to do is figure out who the executive sponsor is and what they actually want. And so, how we access customer data, that's a really important problem. But you can only make progress on this sort of like complex problem with lots of different stakeholders if there's an executive sponsor that's willing to support you in some of the trade-offs, some of the decisions, some of the pushes that you want to make. And in fact, I think most ambiguous problems, when you really make progress on them, are kind of a dance between like a principal engineer and the head of engineering, whoever they might be. And if your dance partner as the head of engineering isn't showing up, you're not going to make progress. You're going to get stuck pretty much immediately. And so the first thing before you start one of these ambiguous problems is figuring out if this is something you're actually going to have a dance partner for. And if you do, making sure you really understand their perspective and their needs and requirements. Otherwise, you're going to think you're making progress, and when you need them, they're not going to support you, and you're going to get stuck, and you're going to be annoyed at them. And hey, it's always fair to be annoyed at executives. Executives are just there to kind of get annoyed at. But this one at least is pretty avoidable. So step 0, figure out who the sponsor is and what they actually want. Step 1, after step 0 is figuring out who all the stakeholders are. So thinking a little bit about this, how do we access customer data problem? I think there were 4 major sets of stakeholders that we thought about initially. Security, how do we actually implement and maintain the audit logs? How do we, hold people accountable and have like clarity about what access is happening? Compliance, like what are our contracts? What are our legal obligations? What are our kind of risks from like a fine perspective, etc. Engineering, how do we actually support the business? How do we maintain and implement the system that works cleanly? And product, again, how do we actually like find the right intersection of the customer problems, the internal customer in this case, of accessing data and also kind of solving it in a clean, easy to maintain way. I think this is where, like a year and a half ago, this is like kind of the map of stakeholders that people were thinking about. But the thing is, like, this was basically the wrong set of stakeholders. It wasn't actually like the right set of stakeholders to solve the problem very efficiently. And the reason why is that all the internal users like weren't viewed as stakeholders in the first pass of this work, which meant that we were able to find a really secure version of the solution that worked really well from our perspective. It just made it really hard to access customer data, but that didn't really support the other set of stakeholders that got missed in kind of the first pass. So people in customer support, someone files a ticket against us asking for help, like resetting their password or something like that. How does that person get access to that account easily to actually perform the reset once you verified that you should? Onboarding a new customer, onboarding a cap table or onboarding a fund that we need to administer coming off a different fund administration company. This takes a ton of work and a ton of access to the data. If you have to keep doing like a really onerous process to get access each time, it can take up a ton of time, and it doesn't necessarily like make anything more secure, right? It just like takes up a ton of time. And again, the actual day-to-day access of administering a fund, when we administer a fund for someone, we are, supporting the accounting for their expenses. We are performing a capital call on their behalf. We are doing distributions on their behalf. So, the internal fund administration person is really like running that business. It's not like accessing the customer data as a one-off for them. Their job is administering this fund. So when we start thinking about these users and not the security, compliance, engineering, product perspective, where it's like very simple, just make it very hard to access customer data, but we start thinking about all these internal users who really need this data on an ongoing basis, our perspective starts to shift a little bit from mapping the stakeholders. 2, you really start building these layers of context. Like, what do these different stakeholders like actually need, and how do they differ from each other? So security and compliance really want to minimize access to customer data, maximize the auditing around it. Product engineering, minimizing the implementation and maintenance costs of the mechanisms to provide access. Internal users, customer support, the onboarding teams, etc., want to minimize friction to accessing that customer data. And so, once you do that mapping of the different layers, you can start to identify like which stakeholders are missing which other perspectives. And so the project engineering one is just like make it cheap and easy to maintain. Sure, that's like a pretty obvious set. But if you look at security compliance, like minimize access, then internal users minimize friction to accessing, you can like say like, hey, these actually do feel like pretty like misaligned perspectives in terms of like what the goals are. You're like, hey, I understand why these two teams would be in conflict with each other. They actually want like two pretty different things. So once you understand like the two conflicting kind of perspectives, the two layers of context that don't work with each other, the next step is to figure out how do you actually develop a multi-dimensional trade-off. And so I think like naive trade-offs are like, hey, we can be secure or we can be easy to use. Sure, that's like one way to think about it, but that's like almost never the right way to actually work through an ambiguous problem. Instead, you want to figure out how to get into a little bit more detail such that you can break the seeming impossibility of these trade-offs into something where everyone gets what they want. And so, for example, for this example one, we should eliminate all access without documented business rationale. So taking the security and compliance one and moving from like we should minimize access to customer data, that's actually maybe not the right goal. Maybe what we want to do is to make it so it's impossible to have any access without a clearly documented business rationale. And then maybe on the customer support side, like we should reduce the overhead of providing business rationales that already exist in other systems. And so all of a sudden we've gone from these two like seemingly like incompatible like opposing points of view about maximizing like security, maximizing ease of use of accessing customer data to something that could actually be solvable in both cases, right? We should always have a business rationale that's like documented explicitly. And if the business rationale exists somewhere else, like how do we make sure that there's no effort to re-provide that rationale? And so here's like a really concrete example of doing that. We identified the open sales tickets assigned to a specific customer and to a specific support agent. And then we're able to automatically provide access to that company's data if there's an open ticket for that part of the company. And the ticket's still open, assigned to the right person. So all of a sudden we've moved from this mode where they'd have to go through a process, request a PIN, have someone else on their company on their team provide that PIN, and coordinate that work to a place where there is actually like a frictionless process for customer support to get access to a given company's data, but in a way where we're doing it with like a really clear reason of why we've done it and clear alignment with the customer's incentives, goals, like asks from us. They're asking for help. They've sent us a ticket. Here's how we can make progress on it. Once you have that set of that trade-off kind of developed, you work on getting people to accept the trade-off. And this is why you can't start this process without an executive sponsor. You really do need the exec sponsor sometimes to help push through kind of the multi-dimensional trade-off you've developed. Even if it solves everyone's problems, sometimes just staffing it will still be pretty hard. This need an exec problem to solve ambiguous problems, exec sponsor to solve ambiguous problems. Sometimes you'll find you just can't get alignment. And in that case, what I encourage you to remember is that delay is always an option. Sometimes it's just the wrong moment to make progress on an ambiguous problem. Pick something else, go focus on that. So again, identify stakeholders, develop these layers of context, develop a multi-dimensional trade-off that kind of breaks the seeming conflict across the layers of context, build alignment, and delay if you got to. And the reason this is so important is that principal engineers take on ambiguous problems that helps scale the execs, and that really is the definition of what makes a principal engineer. And with that, can't believe I misspelled principal on this slide, but that's a different problem, a problem for tomorrow. Anyway, with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Dan, who's going to take us from kind of the ambiguous top-level view of principal engineering to a more detailed, concrete view instead.